In the last video, we talked a fair amount about climate. For instance, macroclimate, which is determined by things like latitude and ocean currents and trade winds and whether you're next to a mountain or a body of water. And microclimate, which is determined by much finer scale differences, both of which can have abiotic factors like temperature, light, water, and microclimate especially can have biotic factors that can affect the individual environment. But our climate currently is in some flux. The biosphere can be profoundly affected by changes in the global climate. And we've seen changes in the global climate as we've studied geology right over the last millions and in some cases billions of years. For instance, 16,000 years ago, ice ages ended and glaciers retreated, and the pattern of distribution of trees and plants changed, and animals as well. And right now, we're seeing the fastest change in the climate that we have ever seen as our climate warms. And that could have a lot of impacts over the ranges of particular species. For instance, the American beach has currently this purple range, but in 4.5 degrees C of warming over the next century, the range would move up here. If it's 6.5 degrees, you would expect to see it move up here, and eventually you run out of places to move. Similarly, altitude shifts can happen in ranges where organisms that need colder weather would have to move further and further up a mountain until there is no mountain anymore. And this is already happening in a lot of species that we've documented. This, for instance, is just over the course of 27 years. There's a moth that's found in northern Europe, in the Nordic countries, and its range has begun to creep up further north in Sweden and Finland. But again, as you move up, eventually you run out of space to move up, and you displace other organisms along the way. Climate is the biggest determinant for biomes, which are major life zones characterized by particular types of vegetation or physical environments, especially when you're talking about aquatic biomes. And these are things like deserts, for instance. And there are a lot of things that all deserts have in common. Mainly they are very, very dry, and so you have to have vegetation that's pretty efficient with its use of water. Now, there are different deserts that each have their own unique ecological properties, right? The Sonoran and Mojave deserts of the southwestern United States are different from the Atacama Desert in Peru or the Sahara Desert in North Africa, but they all have things in common, and they're all desert biomes. Because latitude is such an important factor in climate, latitude often dictates a lot of where you will find certain biomes. For instance, we mentioned already in a past video that 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, because of the pattern of air rise and flow and fall in what are called Hadley cells, that's where you tend to find deserts. You tend to find most of your tropical forest, right, around the equator, within the tropics. That's literally why we call it tropical forest, and it tends to be rainy right around the equator there. As you get cooler, you're going to find more temperate broadleaf forest, and as you get further north than that, you're going to find coniferous forest and then tundra very, very far away from the equator. This graph is called a climograph, and it pairs on the x-axis mean temperature and on the y-axis mean precipitation, because those, again, seem to be the most important things for dictating a biome. And you tend to find, for instance, temperate grassland like you'll find in Kansas, and temperate broadleaf forests like you find around here in Cincinnati, are very similar in terms of temperature, but we get more annual precipitation, and so you find more trees, right? Whereas similar amount of precipitation, but a little bit colder, right? As you move up into northern Minnesota or into Canada, you end up finding more coniferous forests, lots of conifers, pine trees, for instance, up in Montana. And as you get very cold and very dry, we get the Arctic and the alpine tundra, whereas deserts are very similarly dry. In fact, sometimes the Antarctic is considered a desert, but we tend to think of deserts as not just dry but warmer, right? So this tends to be what we see in deserts. Many terrestrial biomes have some level of vertical layering, especially if you have trees and you have some sort of, for instance, in a temperate broadleaf forest, upper canopy, and then you have a lower level where you have smaller trees or shrubs. In the understory and below that, you have herbaceous plants that live on the forest floor, and then a leaf litter area, a place where roots are. You're going to have different kinds of temperatures and different levels of moisture and sunshine, and therefore different kinds of plants and animals at these different vertical layers. So again, temperate broadleaf forest, especially if you go to a tropical rainforest, there's a lot of vertical layering. And because in biomes you tend to have very similar ecological conditions, in different areas of the world that are part of the same biome, you tend to see a lot of convergent evolution. So this right here is a cactus, and you're probably pretty familiar with what that looks like. This is a euphorbia from Africa that looks a lot like a cactus, but they're not very related at all. These similar traits that they have came about through convergent evolution. They are analogous structures because there are similar environmental constraints that they have to deal with. Biomes can also be characterized by disturbances that they see. So these are events that can change a community, things like a storm or a fire, or now a lot of human activity. Fires can kill woody plants. They can make room for more shrubs. And so in the savanna, you tend to have a lot more grassland and then dotted groves of trees, but not the same as like a temperate broadleaf forest. Those fires can create gaps in the forest for different species to grow. We have done a lot of fire suppression since humans have come around in the Great Plains, and that has really changed the vegetation that you see. So now let's take a brief dive into a bunch of different terrestrial biomes to look at how their precipitation and temperature distribution tends to affect the plants and animals that you see. Around the equator, you tend to see tropical forests, mostly tropical rainforests, but some tropical dry forests. The main difference between the two is when you see the rain. So tropical dry forests have very seasonal rains, whereas tropical rainforests have a relatively steady amount of rain and a high amount of rain all year long, but both of these tend to be pretty warm. So 25 to 29 degrees C, meaning like 80s, low 80s, little seasonal variation. Tropical forests have a lot of vertical stratification, layering, ecologically, because they have very tall trees, and they are home to a lot of biodiversity. Tropical rainforests are probably the most biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem that we have, and we don't even know how many species there are. There are millions of, we estimate, undescribed species, especially of insects and spiders and arthropods, other sorts of arthropods. And they're very steady, and this steadiness is one of the reasons that they're able to be so diverse. This is an example of a tropical rainforest in Borneo. Again, a lot of vertical layering, a lot of water, and you tend to find these around the equator, give or take. Deserts are very, very dry. They can be hot or cold. Most are hot, but the Antarctic could be considered a desert because it's very, very dry, and it's very, very cold. Most deserts occur in bands 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator, or in the interior of continents on the dry side of rain shadows with mountains, and precipitation tends to be less than 30 centimeters per year and is often variable. So sometimes you'll get crazy rainstorms out of nowhere in the spring, but not much at other times of the year. Because this lack of water is the defining characteristic of deserts, desert plants are adapted for desiccation tolerance. They have water storage. They have very small leaves and thick waxy cuticles. And they also tend to be home to specific kinds of animals that are also good at avoiding water loss. Snakes and lizards, scorpions, ants, beetles, things like that. A lot of animals are nocturnal because the daytime, especially in hot deserts, can be very, very oppressive It's a time where the sun's shining and you can lose water, so a lot of animals come out at night. Now, we've obviously changed a lot of deserts, and we grow a lot of things in deserts because of irrigation, and it has impacted the biodiversity of certain areas. I'll have you now Google the Bellagio fountains in Las Vegas, which are right smack dab in the middle of the desert. And here you can see the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern United States. This is an ocotillo, which has very, very tiny little pointy leaves and beautiful flowers. And again, that's right here, and you can see these 30-degree bands north and south of the equator. You can also see the patchier life. It's much emptier, for instance, than a tropical rainforest. Savannas are ecosystems that also tend to be pretty warm. They have more variation in temperature, though, than your tropical rainforests, and a little bit more water. Not a ton of water, though, and that water tends to be very, very seasonal. So a lot of the plant species are adapted to seasonal droughts. A lot of them are fire tolerant, and you tend to have big areas of grassland because of these fires, and small dotted areas of trees. And they tend to have then, because of the grasslands, a lot of grazing animals like wildebeests and zebras and lions and hyenas that hunt them. And here's a look at that savanna, an example in Kenya. And again, these are relatively warm, seasonal in their rain, and they tend to be grasslands dotted with trees. Another highly seasonal biome with rainy winters and dry, hot summers is chaparral. So you tend to have really hot, like above 30 degrees C, or like 90s Fahrenheit in the summer, but then it's cooler in the fall and spring and winter. And this is places like the Mediterranean. It's pretty dry, and so you tend to have really small, shrubby kinds of things, again, with thicker leaves, smaller leaves like you'd find in a desert, but a lot more life than in the desert, because it's not quite that dry. And we've had a big impact on chaparral areas because, aside from the Mediterranean, one of the biggest chaparral biomes in the world is in California. And you may be aware that a lot of people now live in California, especially in Southern California, San Diego, Los Angeles area. A lot of this is what you're going to see. It's also a good, wine growing area. The middle of the U.S. tends to be temperate grassland, which is a little bit like savanna in that it's grasses. There are dotted trees occasionally, except it's a lot colder. And there's, again, very seasonal precipitation. Winters can be negative 10 degrees C. Think about being in Iowa in winter. It's terrible. But you still get really, really hot in the summer and wet. So it's very, very highly seasonal precipitation and temperature. But like the savanna, there tend to be some adaptations to fire. There tend to be a lot of grazing animals because of the grasses. And then there used to be some big animals that would then eat those grazing animals. We've now converted a lot of our grasslands into farmlands if you fly over those areas. This is a look at Saskatchewan, but this could be parts of Iowa or Kansas or Minnesota, and it really is beautiful, this grassy area and big open sky. As you move further away from the equator, you can get to the northern coniferous forest, which tends to be very cold in the winter, although it can be hot during the summer or warm, and seasonal precipitation. And the landscape is characterized by conifers like pines and spruce, and you see bands of this across North America and Northern Europe and Asia. We live in an area full of temperate broadleaf forests, which have generally cold winters, hot summers, but much more precipitation than grassland. And we have a lot of vertical layering as well in our ecology, and you can see the eastern United States as well as much of Europe and much of China as well. And finally, we have the tundra, which is cold, relatively low precipitation, and really, really cold winters and even cool summers. It's defined by a permanently frozen layer of soil called the permafrost, which prevents water infiltration and really limits what can grow there, and therefore what kind of animals you can have. It tends to have very large mammals that graze but travel and migrate, and you can see this across much of Russia and Canada and Alaska. This is Denali National Park, which is on my bucket list.